Welcome to the Third Sector podcast, brought to you by the Third Sector editorial team. In this episode, we'll be finding out who the sector's highest earners are. We'll also be looking into the spike of complaints to the fundraising regulator about community interest companies. And we'll be digging into the details of an ongoing investigation into City and Guilds after two executives pocketed more than £1 million each after the sale of one of its branches. I'm your host, Lucinda Rouse, and I'm joined by Dami Adewale.
Hello.
Emily Harle.
Hiya.
And Andy Ricketts.
Hello.
This is our monthly episode where we don't have a guest joining us. It takes the form of an editorial team meeting in which we consider a few recent stories we've been covering that have raised some interesting points. And we're going to start with what I find to be an extremely intriguing story, namely the sale of a massive chunk of City and Guilds to a private entity. Dami, you've been covering this. What is going on?
Yeah, thanks, Lucinda. So the City and Guilds of London Institute sold its training and awards arm in October to a Greek language certification company called PeopleCert. The institute said it would retain about 180 million to 200 million pounds worth of its assets, and it would transfer out 1,400 staff with 12 remaining. And the new organisation at PeopleCert would be called City and Guilds Limited. The institute said its commercial activities in the training and awards field required significant investment, but with the development of AI and other technology, trustees believe that they wouldn't be able to keep up in this field.
So this sale happened in October, and then last month in January, the Charity Commission opened an inquiry into the institute, which is the charitable umbrella of other City and Guilds organisations, including its commercial arm, which has now been sold. Why has the Commission opened an investigation?
So the Commission opened its inquiry after concerns were raised about the sale, in particular the trustees' decision-making before and following the sale. So further concerns were raised about bonuses of a reported 1.7 million and 1.2 million pounds awarded to the charity's chief executive, Kirsty Donnelly, and its chief financial officer, Abid Ismail, respectively. So the regulator's looking into a reported coexistence agreement between the Institute and PeopleCert, but trustees in a statement in January said they were not involved in any pre or post-deal conversations regarding remuneration matters for the City and Guild Limited executives that would apply after the sale. And they said it's a matter for the new owners of City and Guilds Limited.
I mean, it's a really unusual case, isn't it? Because the fact that they basically sold off pretty much the entire of the organisation, I suppose you'd almost equate it to, like, Save the Children selling off its developmental arm or something like that. Or probably actually, to give a slightly better example, maybe the Consumers Association, which is obviously more commonly known to everybody as Which, selling off its commercial arm, its kind of publishing business, is something that we don't really see in the voluntary sector ever. And the fact that these chief executives have got these big bonuses, it just smells a bit fishy. I mean, obviously, we're not accusing anybody of any wrongdoing, but it's just a very unusual thing to happen in the voluntary sector. We don't see it.
And it makes you wonder what is left and what the purpose of the organisation is going to be going forward. I know that there is now also the City and Guilds Foundation, which is registered with the same charity number on the Commission's register as the City and Guilds of London Institute, that umbrella organisation. They have an interim chief executive who's been in post since November 2025. Is it going to be a case of the charity just operating at a much smaller scale with a much smaller remit without all of these training and certification programs that it previously had, which formed the bulk of what they did?
And will their charitable objects need to be altered off of the back of that? I think that's another question that we need to consider here. Is changing charitable objects is not an easy thing to do. It's not just quick sign a bit of paper and that's it. It does take a long time. So considering the sale must have been in the works for a while, I wonder if there's been any thought put into what those new objects might be if they do find that they need to permanently change that on the charities register.
Do we have any idea what might happen next?
Well, PeopleCert also commissioned an internal investigation about the circumstances surrounding the sale, and the company said Donnelly and Ismail will be absent from work pending the result of the investigation. So I guess now we're waiting on the outcomes of both investigations to see whether there was any misconduct. Obviously, we're not casting any aspersions, but I think it's best to wait to see what's going on at the charity before we make any determinations.
Yeah, it's interesting that the company who bought these assets has now commissioned an internal investigation as a result of, I think it was The Guardian breaking this story back in December. You wonder quite what they're going to be investigating and what the outcome of that will be. Not sure we shed a huge amount of light on this story, but perhaps raised the fact of how complex it is and how out of the ordinary it is. And hopefully in a few weeks' time, we might be able to revisit the topic and really see what has gone on and quite why these two executives have walked away from the sale of the bulk of a charity, or at least the commercial arm of a charity with more than £1 million in their pocket each. But remaining on the topic of high paid charity executives, not necessarily in the form of bonuses, Andy, you are now able to issue a great sigh of relief, having been working on a very large piece of work over the past few months, looking into the highest earning individuals in the voluntary sector.
Yeah, that's right. Third Sector has just published our salary study, which is an annual exercise that involves me spending weeks with my head buried in charity annual accounts. We basically identify the highest paid individuals by looking at accounts on the Charity Commission website, and then come up with a top 100 list showing the highest earning people at those top 100 charities. And it must be said at the outset that this is in no way indicative of charity pay across the board. This is the top 100, and they're very much outliers. The entry point for the top 100 this year is between £240,000 and £250,000, which is far and away higher than what the average charity chief executive is paid. Akivo did their annual pay and reward survey at the back end of last year, which showed that the average charity CEO pay was just under £60,000. So it's a completely different ballpark that we're dealing with here.
So what kind of organisations are represented in that top 100 list?
There are hardly any typically what you might regard as fundraising charities. I mean, there are one or two, including Save the Children UK, Save the Children International, AIDS UK is another one that's in there, Cancer Research UK. But obviously those are all huge, massive, complicated, multi-million pound organisations. But the bulk are things like professional associations, grant-making foundations, and other kind of non-fundraising charities. So the biggest is, and normally is, Welcome, the huge grant maker, which for the last many years now has employed its own dedicated in-house investment team to manage its £40 billion investment portfolio. The charity has always said that it's far more cost effective for it to employ specialist investment managers in-house than pay hundreds of millions of pounds to other companies to do it on their behalf. And it's more effective to do it in-house. And consequently, the highest earning individual at Welcome, and of course in the whole UK voluntary sector, turns out to be Nick Mokes, who is the former Chief Investment Officer at Welcome. He retired last year, so it's his last time in the list, but he was paid just under £4.5 million in 24-25.
Not too shabby at all. But for those who form our core third sector audience, what do you think are the most interesting findings for them?
I think part of it indicates the sort of difference really between your average fundraising charity and these other organisations, which probably your average person in the street wouldn't even regard as a charity. Like, you know, we've got things like the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, the Chartered Management Institute, the Shell Foundation. You know, if you asked somebody in the street to name 1,000 charities, they probably would never mention hardly any of the charities in our list. So it's very much removed from your average charity. I think what it does is it shows that your average charity is really not paying these sort of sums. Some of the biggest fundraising charities, you know, for example, Oxfam, they're so far away from even being on this list that all the kind of perceived anger that you get from a small proportion of people who say, I'm not going to donate to charity because they pay too much in salaries and it's all fat cats and all this kind of stuff. It's really not fundraising charities that are paying these large amounts.
This is a conversation I've had with people in my life, I think over Christmas actually, talking about chief executive pay, charities, and trying to sort of explain that those outliers are in fact outliers, and the people on our salary study list are far removed from the likes of Oxfam and other fundraising organisations that people would name when you ask them to name a charity. So it's really interesting reading that list and seeing just how removed it is from our public understanding and public consciousness of what a charity is. But then it's interesting how those perceptions of charity chief executives earning too much still seep through when there's much evidence to the contrary.
And if you compare it with what the private sector pays, the High Pay Centre does an annual study looking at the average remuneration of FTSE 100 chief executives, and they found last year that the average pay among that top 100 was £4.6 million. The average was £4.6 million among these top 100 people. So even the most highest paid person in the voluntary sector, which is far and away higher than any other normal charity chief executive, isn't even getting paid the average of those top 100. And the top two people on that list were the current and former chief executive of the aerospace technology company Melrose, who received combined pay of £59 million in the last year. So obviously the charities in our list, they are large, complex organisations in many cases, and charity chief executives are managing complicated organisations that in many cases employ thousands of people. So it very much shows that charity chief executives are being underpaid in comparison to the expertise they offer to the organisation that employs them.
So I think you've nicely reinforced the point that most people listening to this podcast will already know, that charity chief executives are not the fat cats who are in it for the money. And these numbers here at the very top end are dwarfing the average that came out in Akivo's Pay Inequality Survey, which was £60,000 or just under. And that figure had gone down, albeit because they had more smaller charities in the past year. Whereas at this top end of the range, it went up, didn't it, by about 5%?
That's right, yeah. I mean, it was slightly above the rate of inflation, which kind of shows that what you might actually say are the fat cats at the top of the sector are getting paid a bit more. But again, it's not indicative of what's going on at grassroots level.
So moving on from issues of pay, questionable bonuses, and into another area of the voluntary sector in the form of community interest companies and complaints that have been made about them. Emily, you've been following this story. What's it all about?
Yeah, so this is a long-running story, really. The reason I bring it up today is because the fundraising regulator has now released its Casework Insights and Trends report, which revealed that fundraising by community interest companies, or CICs, has accounted for nearly 1 in 5, that's 18%, of complaints made to the regulator over the past year. Now, this was a 50% increase from the previous year, when CICs accounted for just 12% of all complaints made. Most of these concerns related to negative fundraiser behaviour, pressure to donate, inadequate licences and permissions, and misleading fundraising practices. And while these figures are new, as I said, non-compliance by CICs has been an ongoing problem for the fundraising regulator, and it has been putting a lot of resourcing into trying to tackle this issue. So one example that we've seen of late is We Are Blighty. This is a CIC that supports military veterans, and the organisation was found last year to have committed 9 breaches of the fundraising code, including by allowing inappropriate fundraising behaviour, misleading the public, and carrying out face-to-face fundraising without the appropriate licences. So a lot of the same issues that have come up in this new report. The organisation and 2 of its directors were actually charged and hit with fines totalling more than £3,600 for carrying out illegal street collections in central London. So that's just one example, and I could sit here listing off far more, but I think the interesting thing about this new report is that it actually shows that these practices and complaints about CICs has been drastically on the rise over the past year. I mean, an increase of 50% is quite high. So it begs the question, how does this affect the public perceptions of charities when people are seeing CICs on the streets fundraising in a way that might be less than code compliant.
I have quite a few questions and sadly very few to no answers. One of which is, are these complaints rising because there are more CICs out there now, or that CICs are increasingly pursuing street fundraising activities in order to raise money? Do you have any light to shed on that?
So the regulator actually said that 15% of all complaints about CICs related to just 2 high-profile organisations, including We Are Blighty, as I mentioned, but also Inside Success Union, which is a CIC that offers training and employment opportunities for young people to create a quarterly magazine. So this increase is partially due to just 2 bad actors in this space, and both of them were found to have committed 9 breaches of the code each. But the real concern about this stems from how the public perceives the actions of these 2 high-profile organisations and how that affects their perceptions of CICs, but also charities and charity fundraisers as a whole.
It will be interesting to hear how the fundraising regulator plans to respond to this. But before we go on to that, I thought it might be pertinent to play a short clip from an interview that you and I did, Emily, with Paul Wynyard, who's the head of policy at the fundraising regulator. We spoke to him in September and asked him about this very issue and the likely impact that it's having on charities. So I'm just going to play a brief excerpt from that.
When a member of the public sees a community interest company fundraising, they don't see a community interest company fundraising, they see a charity. And so when that organisation engages in poor behaviour, like I say, whether or not that's, not having a licence or pressuring people to donate, harassing people, not leaving them alone when they're told no, as a fundraiser should, then, members of the public see that as a reflection of charitable fundraising more broadly. And as a regulator, we're here to principally support and to protect members of the public from harm and poor practice. But equally, we're here to help fundraising organisations thrive. We want to make sure that these organisations don't have a negative impact on the charitable fundraising brand and the charity brand, which I think they do, quite frankly.
So it's good to know that the regulator is fully aware of the risks to charities caused by poor behaviour of some of these CICs. Do we have any insight yet into how the regulator is responding to this problem?
So the fundraising regulator has already convened a national coalition of enforcement and regulatory bodies to strengthen the regulation and enforcement of unlicensed fundraising by CICs. This coalition, which we have previously reported on at Third Sector, is formed of regulators and enforcement bodies, including the Charity Commission, the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, and the Metropolitan Police. The group previously sent a letter to the Civil Society Minister, Stephanie Peacock, pushing for tougher sanctions to deter these rogue operators, saying that current legislation is not fit for purpose. But we've yet to see much action from this.
And that was back in the summer, if I remember correctly. And one of the issues is that the amount that local councils or local authorities who are responsible for enforcement can fine these CICs is so low that it's not a sufficient deterrent.
I think the real question here is it will take quite a while for legislation to come in. So in the meantime, what can the voluntary sector do to mitigate the impact on public perception? I mean, we've seen how quickly public opinion about charities can snowball after the media picks up reports about some charities' wrongdoing. And while this is CICs rather than charities, they're still viewed as part of the voluntary sector. They are part of the voluntary sector. So as Paul said, there is a real risk of reputational harm for all fundraising organisations here. Individually, each organisation just needs to be really doing what they can to make sure their fundraisers are given the appropriate training and are knowledgeable about how to navigate a conversation with someone on the street and when to back down.
Yeah, I think that is the key point, isn't it? It's the what Paul said about the broader implications for voluntary sector fundraisers. I mean, we already see there's quite a lot of negative sentiment among the public or a certain section of the public towards street fundraisers. Quite a lot of people will say they don't like being approached. They don't like seeing a charity fundraiser outside Waitrose or wherever it is they don't like being accosted in the street. And some of them would say they even less like having their front door knocked on by a charity fundraiser. So if there's no distinction in their mind between CICs and regular charities, it's only going to be a negative impact, particularly for those people who already think poorly about charities anyway.
But we've covered research showing that it is still, both forms that you've just mentioned, on the street and door knocking, highly, highly effective forms of fundraising for charities and for all the people that complain. I mean, it's not a huge number of complaints. How many was it in CICs?
So the regulator received 73 complaints about CICs out of a total of 387 complaints overall.
In the space of a year.
In the space of a year.
So the number of positive interactions that must have taken place between street fundraisers and donors absolutely dwarfs that in comparison to the complaints.
And just because a complaint has been received, it doesn't mean that that complaint has been upheld. We don't know how many of these complaints were, investigated and found to be sort of valid concerns, and how many of them were someone's maybe upset at seeing the same people outside their door again and again.
But of course, the other thing we don't know is the number of people who are approached by one of these fundraisers, have a negative interaction, but then don't decide to complain. I suspect there are a lot of people who wouldn't know even that the fundraising regulator existed and that they could make a complaint about a negative interaction with a fundraiser. So I think the ones that get to the fundraising regulator are probably quite serious in the eyes of the individual that's complaining. But you wonder to what extent people's perception of charity overall is being affected by negative interactions with fundraisers, whether they're from a CIC or a regular mainstream charity.
Let's hope that petition to the government gets a robust response soon. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back again with another team meeting at the beginning of March. Next week, we'll be joined by 2 guests to find out how gaming and streaming can be a lucrative fundraising channel for charities. But for now, from all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.